Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And yes, the work I'm presenting today, Research and Resources, Examining the Federal Policy Debate in Teacher Evaluation, is based off of the research funded by the WT Grant Foundation, so I thank them for that. And it's a co-authored paper. My two co-authors are Sarah Gailey and Megan Tompkins-Stang. The three of us were all together in Michigan for a while. Me and Sarah at Michigan State and Megan at the Ford School at the University of Michigan. And we've all now scattered. So I'm on sabbatical this year, as is Megan. And Sarah is now a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh. But we're all still working together very closely on this project. So to begin, for orienting the talk today, this graph is to provide some context. So this is a graph where I simply looked up research published through Web of Science on the subject of teacher quality. And as you can see, and as probably many people in this room are aware, this is a field that has grown substantially in the last 15 years. And even if I were to have gone back into the 1990s for this graph, you would see year after year of single digits in terms of the number of publications, but an uptick beginning in 2004 that continued quite steadily of more and more research being produced on this topic of teacher quality. And this work deals with inputs. How do we measure teacher quality? What's the relationship of teacher preparation to teacher quality? How can we measure teacher quality in terms of student outcomes? People in this room have worked in this field and published some of the things that would appear here. But I'm here as a political scientist, and you're not going to find my work in this graph. My questions today are about this world, the world of research, in relation to the world of politics and the political debate. So in the simplest terms, you might think about a question like, how much research enters the political process? And a very kind of naive hypothesis to answer that question might be, as peer-reviewed research grows, so does use. And I suspect many people in this room would immediately call into question that hypothesis, that you would have 5 times the research use in the political debate in 2015 than you did early in the 2000s, right? That we assume and know in many respects that the political system shapes and guides how research is taken up and when and in what ways and which research. And so that's my goal today, is to provide some empirical understanding about what is going on in terms of impacting that process. And to begin, I think we need to start with a very basic sort of shared understanding about what is research. I just showed you a graph that was showing peer-reviewed research, but if you go and talk to policymakers, that's not what they're thinking about. And so we need to start from that as a base of understanding, is what is research in the eyes of the people who are making policy. And what we know here is that the definition of research in politics is very broad, it's very fluid. It very rarely, if ever, is confined to peer-reviewed research, and quite a bit of what is viewed as research is not peer-reviewed research. It includes reports, it includes advocacy work, and it includes things that you might even describe as bits of evidence, sort of taken for granted wisdom about a field that's treated as a piece of evidence. Additionally, we know that the feedback loops goes both ways, right? Research might be getting inserted to influence politics, but politics also influences research. There's a large role of think tanks in the political world, across the policy realm, across many different areas of policy, health, environment, et cetera. And certainly research within education confirms this about the importance of non-university organizations that produce research. And then additionally, coming into the work that I've focused on, we have a role of funders in influencing the output of information and ideas and research. And so I've worked on this in the past on local politics. Leslie Finger studies the role of funders in terms of state politics. And what we are seeing in many cases is that funders are aligning their advocacy, their programmatic goals, and their research goals to push together in a similar direction. And a work that I'll draw your attention to that helps kind of inform some of our questions in this study is Michael Feuer's book, The Rising Price of Objectivity, Philanthropy, Government, and the Future of Education Research, and he puts the issue this way. Donor incentives to fund objective research and evaluation in conjunction with or in addition to their programmatic investments are not always compatible with their natural proclivities to seek evidence that their projects are succeeding. So there's this issue in terms of how research might be framed by funders who are active in that particular area. So my case today, where I'm going to investigate this relationship of research and politics and funding, is the case of teacher evaluation. And what we know about teacher evaluation suggests a lot of interesting features of this policy area for thinking about the influence of these varying factors. One, of course, is the fact that research is hugely important in the development of teacher evaluation policy. It's almost impossible to imagine teacher evaluation, particularly relying on value-added models, outside of the body of research that developed those techniques. So you have the development of value-added models, and then you also have sort of the growth of a taken for granted wisdom of the importance of teacher effects on student achievement. And so I have the quote from Bill Gates here, but you can see this quote in many people's mouths around this time in 2008, that a growing body of evidence tells us that teacher effectiveness is the single most important factor in student achievement. So additionally, we have the fact that teacher evaluation policy has changed. So something happened in this debate. It wasn't simply discussed and debated with no outcomes. Rather, policy changed emanating from the federal level, and it changed somewhat rapidly given the pace of political time. So under the Obama administration, we had two major initiatives, the Race to the Top program and the No Child Left Behind waivers, that incentivized states to adopt teacher evaluation policies that would incorporate student outcomes through standardized tests into their evaluation systems. And over a fairly brief time period, 31 states adopted evaluation reforms requiring student data. But then, not too many years into the future, by 2015, when Congress reauthorized the ESEA in the form of the ESSA with the Every Student Succeeds Act, they backed off this requirement for states to use test scores in teacher evaluations. And then additionally, we have this issue of the role of philanthropy that can be very clearly identified in a couple of ways, that funders were drawing attention to this issue and investing resources in these ideas. And I'll bring up two of them here. And probably many of you in this room are familiar with the second, the MET project, and the large funding initiative by the Gates Foundation around teacher effectiveness. I'm not sure if the Ed in 08 campaign is quite as familiar, but I want to bring it up because in terms of the timeline, it sort of is an interesting earlier step by funders into this issue area. So the Ed in 08 campaign was during the 2008 presidential election between Barack Obama and John McCain, and it was an effort jointly funded by the Gates Foundation and the Broad Foundation to raise the profile of education issues in the presidential election. That was a tall order. If you remember the 2008 campaign, there was a recession underway. Healthcare was a big issue. Most people would say they weren't especially successful at getting the candidates to talk much about education. That said, they did have a three-pronged set of agendas, and one of those agendas was teacher effectiveness. They wanted to focus on performance-based innovation in teacher effectiveness. And then shortly thereafter, we had the announcement of the Gates Foundation Teaching Effectiveness Initiative, which included a total of $696 million invested from 2008 to 2013. Their self-reported numbers in terms of the amount of money for different areas included $50 million on research and $51 million on advocacy. And that, of course, included the funding for the Measures of Effective Teaching study, which was a large research initiative. So these are the questions that I'm going to seek to answer today with our study. And broadly speaking, the overarching question is, how did research and resources influence the national policy debate on teacher evaluation? And this is a mixed method study. I'm drawing in part on congressional hearings from 2003 to 2015, which we'll be analyzing with social network analysis. And additionally, we've conducted 60 elite interviews and coded those qualitatively. So the first set of questions draw from the congressional hearings and the social network analysis. And the questions here are related to what was being said in the federal policy debate and who was saying those policies and expressing support for them. So first of all, how often did congressional hearing participants who supported teacher evaluation refer to research in their testimony? And how does this compare to another area of teacher quality preferences? Does evaluation somehow look different than when people talk about other types of teacher quality issues? Second, what is the better predictor of hearing witness support for teacher evaluation? So when someone comes up and makes a recommendation related to teacher evaluation, which predicts that better? Is it their mentions of research, or is it their funding private foundations that are involved in supporting teacher evaluation? And then thirdly, we're interested in time. We have this nice long time horizon in our data from 2003, shortly after the adoption of No Child Left Behind, all the way up to the ESSA debates in Congress. So included in that time horizon, of course, is a change in presidential administration from the Bush to the Obama administration. And we're interested in whether different factors might play a larger role at different points of time, with a particular focus on what we describe as that policy window when the Obama administration came into office, roughly from the period of 2008 to 2010. And then with our qualitative interviews, we try to get a little deeper into the interactions that might be going on here. So we're interested in how major participants in the debate describe the role of research and the role of funders, and how do funders use research? And then in terms of, as we understand how they're using research, how might that style of use impact the way research is communicated in policy debates? So from a theoretical standpoint, we're operating with some theories drawn from the political science and public policy world in terms of the policy process. And first of all, we're drawing on theories about networks in policymaking. And here, the assumption is that policymaking is an interdependent process. So studying it in assuming that actors are isolated and independent from one another misses the reality of interdependence, that people are aware of and reacting to the behavior, the ideas, the strategies, the coalitions of others who are involved in the policy process. We draw, in particular, from work by Philip Liefeld, and so this paper that I'm quoting here uses a very similar method. Policymaking happens in a complex and intertwined setting. And so actors take others' ideas and positions into account. And so the tool we use to analyze this that accounts for this interdependence is social network analysis. And then secondly, we're drawing from the theory about time, that policy windows matter, that it's not the same necessarily to introduce an idea in 2005, 2006, as it is, say, in 2009. And so this is probably best known from John Kingdon's work, when does an idea's time come? And that policy windows are impacted by the political environment, and particularly we're focusing on a change in administration here. So for our methods, we're using something called discourse network analysis. And the body of data that go into the discourse network analysis are the congressional hearings. And I know just a few weeks ago that Laura Perna was here and gave a talk that also drew on congressional hearings. So I'll refer a little to her work because I've read that paper as well. And it's important to note, right, that hearings are a unique kind of social setting, a very formal setup, heavily guided by the members of the committee who invite the participants. So we are fully acknowledging that and the public nature of the debate that takes place. They're also important for policymaking. So research on hearings has shown that hearing testimony is positively associated with proposal enactment. So they are very, very worthwhile to study for this reason. Our data comes from 175 congressional hearings that we searched on the subject of teacher quality. We were inclusive as possible. So any hearing that included substantive discussion of teacher quality, we included in our data set. So to analyze these hearings, we're using discourse network analysis, and this is a technique developed, as I mentioned, by Philip Liefeld. I do want to distinguish this because I know Laura Perno's work uses critical discourse analysis, and that's not the same as discourse network analysis, even though they both have the words discourse and analysis in the name. So discourse network analysis essentially combines content analysis with social network analysis. What we're doing is we're analyzing the content of the policy debate, what is said, what a witness comes forward and says in their testimony. We're analyzing that systematically, and we're identifying when they say a preference for a policy. When that individual says, for instance, I think teachers should be evaluated with value-added models, or I think teachers should be evaluated with a technique that uses multiple methods for evaluation. So that is what we're coding for. We're coding for the mentions of policy preferences. But what's added to that is the network aspect. So it's not simply that I, as an individual, said this, and I'm isolated from everyone else who might have been involved in that congressional debate. We're interested in the relationships. So if you think about it as a network through this visualization, these circles would be the hearing participants. These are the people who were witnesses who participated in a hearing. So this could be a representative from Education Trust, and this could be a representative from a teachers union, and this individual could be a university researcher who was invited to testify. And then X, Y, and Z represent 3 different policy preferences that were brought up in that debate. So if we assume, say, that X is we should evaluate teachers with multiple measures, then we know that this person and this person both expressed support for that policy. They both were supporters of the same policy preference in the debate. This other witness mentioned something different. The added analytical leverage you get with network analysis is that we're not assuming that these are independent. So this person here would know about these other policy preferences and that there's more popularity associated with this than with theirs. So the idea with network analysis is that you're not assuming away that interdependence in the debate. You can actually account for it in your model. And these are what's called 2-mode networks because we have both the actors as one mode and the preferences as another. So in order to code our hearings, we needed to have a code book of policy preferences to assign to the various actors. And we developed this at first somewhat inductively. We read bodies of hearings to see what was being discussed in the debate, what issues were coming up, and we ultimately developed a rather lengthy code book of roughly 50 policy preferences. I'm not going to focus on all of them today. But we wanted to organize this, not to think about it as isolated buckets of preferences, but rather systematically. And there's a theory to draw on for this, which is the Advocacy Coalition Framework, another theory of the policy process that focuses on how policy preferences are rooted in deep beliefs about the policy system and about how to enact values in the policy world. And so we organized our code book on that very same basis, where certain policies would be rooted in different deep core beliefs, then tied to a more generalized policy belief, and then to the more specific preferences, which you might think of as instruments to achieve or enact that broader belief. So up at the top, you have the efficiency core belief, the idea that you can maximize outputs by being more efficient on your inputs. And this is the bucket where we have the generalized idea of teacher evaluation. That teacher evaluation, you know, if it works, should increase your efficiency. You should be able to maximize your outputs with the inputs that you have. And excuse me, the policy core belief with that would be that teachers should be evaluated and they should be held accountable for their outcomes. A few instruments that might be used to achieve that are using evaluation systems with growth models, using evaluation systems with multiple measures. A different core belief that we also coded for that was also present in the policy debate was the idea of equality, that somehow the distribution of teachers or the distribution of resources should be better matched vis-a-vis inequalities in our society or in the educational system. And one example of this that comes up in the debate is the idea that the composition of the teacher workforce can disadvantage some groups in society. So we often see this coming up in discussions about the composition of the teacher workforce being predominantly white females, for instance. And so some of the policy preferences associated with that is the idea that teachers need specific types of training when they're working with disadvantaged students. And so that's, again, different core belief associated with that, different sets of instruments associated with achieving it. As I said, our code book is a lot longer than this, but this is designed to give you some examples of how we coded the hearings. And what we did was we tried to code our statements to the most specific level available. So sometimes it was only clear that the witness was in favor of evaluation. They wanted teachers to be evaluated, but they didn't say how. They didn't really say anything more about it. This is an example, just to show you some of the background in the coding, of someone where we could code for the more specific instrument, which we did as much as we could. So this one says, our own investigation into performance pay issues have led us to conclude that we need to measure teacher effectiveness in multiple ways. Why? There are many influences on student learning. Identifying effective teachers requires evaluating their practices, assessing their performance, and examining the different ways they get academic results for students. So this would be coded with this, use evaluation systems with multiple measures. The person is clearly expressing that specific instrument. Additionally, we coded each time a witness refers to research. And this falls into kind of two buckets. Sometimes people mentioned a source for their research, a report from Brookings, a report from AEI, a report from Education Trust. Sometimes you even know the title of the report or the authors. But we also we tried to be as inclusive as possible. So we included any mention that alluded to systematic evidence. Research says, modern research shows us, a study. These are also included in our coding if they're referring to that in their testimony. We coded for foundation grant funding, and this is based on the witness's organizational affiliation. So if I'm getting up to testify and I am testifying due to my affiliation with Education Trust, and within the last 2 years of my giving that testimony, Education Trust received a $1,000 grant from the Gates Foundation, then that's going to be coded in our data. We focused on the Gates and Broad Foundations for a variety of reasons related to background research that Megan and I have done about their agendas and their relationship to focusing on teacher effectiveness. So 27% of the witnesses in our data are Gates Foundation grantees and 13% are Broad grantees. We also coded all our witnesses based on categories. I'm not using this in the analysis today, but I did want to share this as background just to give you a sense of who's testifying in these hearings. So we have 552 total observations of testimony across the 175 hearings, 349 unique observations, so some some organizations get to testify on multiple occasions. And among some of the categories that stand out of interest, 14% are representing a school district, only 2.5 are representing a union, 15% are representing universities. One of our largest category is this intermediary category, which includes think tanks and advocacy research organizations, a somewhat fluid category, but 26% fall into that. We also have state officials, federal officials, other categories as well. So first I want to present some descriptive data. So when and how frequently did our witnesses in these hearings discuss teacher evaluation and research? So this graph presents both of those things in one graph. So I'm going to take a moment to explain what's going on here. So this goes from 2003 all the way to 2015, our full time period of hearings. And the blue line is the number of witnesses testifying in that year who said anything in our code book supportive of teacher evaluation. And the axis for this is over on this side, so it goes all the way up to 40. So you can see it's a very spiky graph with a peak in 2007, and then a very high peak of more than 35 mentions in 2010. And then it goes back down after 2010. The gray bars are the proportion of those witnesses who mentioned research. And this is the big broad any type of mention of research of any kind. And that goes with this axis over here, which goes all the way from 0 up to 100% of the witnesses. So what you can see is something roughly inverse here, where when only 6 people talked about teacher evaluation in 2004, all 6 of them mentioned research in their testimony. By comparison, in 2010, when a much larger number of people talked about teacher evaluation, fewer than half talked about research in their testimony. So that's what you see over time for teacher evaluation. And again, the research mentions go up a bit towards the end. And for the sake of comparison, this is the graph with the same indicators for the equality preferences that I mentioned from our code book. And what I think is interesting to point out here is, on the one hand, you still see that spiky trend with number of mentions of the policy, again, a peak in 2010, something's going on in 2010, but a much more steady rate of research mentions here. Generally, on average, higher than what we saw in teacher evaluation, and not as up and down. So also on a descriptive basis, I'm going to show you a little about the sources of research in these 2 preference areas. So the supporters, people who mentioned support for teacher evaluation preferences, compared to the people who mentioned support for equality-related preferences. And the black bars are evaluation, the striped are the equality preferences. And this is people who, when we could identify a source, mentioned a think tank as their source of research, universities or higher ed, federal government, and national academies. So these are organized from the most frequent source for the evaluation preferences to the lowest. And what you can see here is a bit of a shift from what you might think of as less objective sources of research to somewhat more objective sources of research. And the somewhat less objective sources, the think tanks, are being used more frequently by the supporters of teacher evaluation. There's not a huge difference between these 2 policy areas, but there are slight differences along the way. So that's our descriptive data. And now I'm going to shift over to the inferential model with the network analysis. So the model that I'm using here is called an exponential random graph model. And the reason for using this model, of course, is that this is network data. And so you cannot estimate a model that assumes independent observations when you're using social network data. And what ERGM does is it estimates the probability that a network is observed given other potential permutations of the network. So we're using Monte Carlo Markov chain. It's 1,000 networks are being simulated in order to estimate the probability of the observed network. And the dependent variable is the network. we are predicting that network. The observed network is our dependent variable. And another way to think about that in terms of the data structure is it's a matrix, right? It's a matrix of all those actors, all those witnesses who gave testimony, and then all their policy preferences, and then zeros and ones, right? I said this, I didn't say this. So that is our dependent variable. And we estimate 3 different models because, as I mentioned, we're very interested in the time slices here playing a possible role. So one model for the Bush, kind of the core period of the Bush administration that we have from 2003 to 2007, our policy window, which includes the presidential election through the first 2 years of the Obama administration, 2008 to 10, and then the Obama administration from 2011 to 2015. And then I just use this little slice of the visual to remind you, right, that this is our dependent variable. That's what it looks like in visual terms. I'm not showing you all the networks. The reality is that networks with 100 nodes always look like spaghetti. So they, you know, a little slice of what they look like. These are our witnesses, and then these are the policies they support. Some policies are getting lots of people supporting them. Now, what you can do with an ERGM is you include 2 different types of independent variables. One set of independent variables are your endogenous terms. These are about the network and the network effects that you might observe. And then you can include node-level attributes, predictors about those individual actors in your network. So the endogenous terms that we look for are, 1, the idea of preference overlap. How much are people in these hearings tending to say multiple preferences, to say we should do evaluation this way, but we should also do this, and we should also do this? Or are they tending to, you know, just mention a few things? And then secondly, which maybe is more substantively interesting, is the idea of preference popularity, that if a certain policy idea is getting attention from other people, that increases the likelihood of other people to also nominate that policy idea. Our node-level attributes are simply 2 dummy variables. Did you mention any kind of research or did you not? And did you get Gates or Broad funding in the last 2 years or did you not? So these are the results. And what you can see here, so first of all, just to fully explain the table, right, we have our 3 dependent variable networks with the 3 time slices all reported up here, independent variables over there. The edges term is a term that you always use in an ERGM model. It's the baseline odds of creating a tie in the network. In terms of the endogenous variables, I'll mostly just point out that the preference popularity variable is positive and significant across all of our models. But I particularly want to draw your attention to 2 of the node level variables. First of all, this row is for the actor mentioning research. And what we can see in particular is in the early part of the time period that is negative and statistically significant. This could, of course, go along with the fact that there was less research in the field at that time. But we never find a positive, significant relationship with research and support for teacher evaluation policies in our hearings. We do, however, during the policy window time, find a positive and significant relationship to being funded by the Gates or Broad Foundation. And so you can see that there. A little bit about the coefficients here. ERGMs don't really lend themselves to doing predictive probabilities, unfortunately, but the coefficients are similar to logit coefficients. They can be interpreted as the conditional log odds of a tie between an actor and a preference conditional on the other ties in the network. So think about it as similar to logit. If you're worried about the network models, I can tell you I've estimated the very same things using logit, using regression, using other independent variables in the networks. The results are the same. But I have a lot of confidence in these models in terms of the way it's rooted in theories of the policy process. So now I'm going to shift to talk about the interview results. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of endogeneity here as far as both the quality of the research and whether or not the foundations get involved. I mean,
Yeah.
Over this period of time, I was doing work in financial parties as part of their platform in 2008. But the Gates Foundation hadn't stepped in and said, well, we'd like to be a part. They didn't fund it initially. They weren't part of it. But when they saw that this was actually going to be something of import, then they came to us and said, hey, we'd love to be involved.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions, right, that I have in trying to think a little bit about these witnesses is whether or not there's kind of this endogeneity where as they recognize experts or studies that might wind up having an influence, if they just get behind it. And so it's really, so which is it? Is it the foundation that's driving it, or is it more the actual subject matter itself? And that's one of the places I'm struggling to try to think through.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's, I think another, and some of that I might answer as I talk about the interviews. I guess the one thing I would add, though, on that is if you go back to thinking about the research production, certainly in this field, is that as this debate was happening, a lot more research was being produced, a lot of which added quite a bit of nuance to those early findings that motivated the initial investment. And that we're not seeing evidence of even the most basic caveats or specific aspects of entering this debate necessarily at that time. So there's sort of the question of whether in making that move, even if, yes, the initial move is informed by research, what might happen then to the updating of the information as a funder strategy becomes very prominent in the policy realm. And so, but yeah, maybe the interviews will also add to that. And so, in going into this, part of what we're trying to explore more is some of the interaction. We know that we're finding that resources are a better predictor of teacher evaluation support than research mentions. They're especially significant during the policy window. But how do resources interact with research, right? Funders are funding research. They're aware of research, right? So it's not as if these are, and I'm not saying they're mutual. I would not want to say they're mutually exclusive. That's not really our argument, but how are funders using research and how might that impact sort of what's being translated into the policy debates? So our interview methods draw from 60 qualitative, semi-structured interviews, and we interviewed some of the people who are in our hearings, authors of reports, funders, advocacy and think tank staff and leaders. We interviewed people from the Federal Department of Education, congressional staffers, and researchers themselves. And these were all transcribed and iteratively coded. So one thing that our interviews helped us hone in on ties back to some of my introduction at the beginning, sort of the arrival of funders to the policy goal of teacher evaluation, which we had sort of come in initially dating around 2008, but the interviews are drawing attention to some earlier moves in terms of the time horizon. So the policy goals related to teacher evaluation, I think we can probably more accurately date as very publicly known by 2008, but developed earlier, certainly in 2007, evidence of that. So one interviewee mentioned that in 2007, a commission on No Child Left Behind that Gates paid for and Aspen organized released a report that really highlighted some of these ideas. And when we've gone back and looked at the report, one of the recommendations was that states would be required to put in place systems for measuring the learning gains of a teacher's students through a value-added methodology. So that's 2007, and then of course in 2008 we had the much more public announcements with the No8 campaign, the Gates Foundation Teacher Effectiveness Agenda. But what we also know, and what our congressional hearing analysis sort of further emphasizes, is that there's not really a policy window at this time. And what we would add in terms of some of the interpretation of this, what was happening and at that time, is that the funders we're looking at were adopting the perspective of strategic philanthropy. They were clearly articulating their goals at the outset. They would be updating with evidence to inform those decisions, but it's important to note that they weren't going back to basic questions, right? They weren't going back to sort of first principles. They had selected this agenda, and their goal in terms of their grant making was to advance that agenda and to invest, whether it was in research or advocacy, to do that. So when there's a body of work about this, probably some of the best known people related to it are Paul Brest and Hal Harvey, who made some of the recommendations that funders have adopted around the idea of strategic philanthropy. How do you advance your goal most effectively and efficiently? So another thing that came up over and over again in our interviews was the widget effect report from the New Teacher Project. I mean, everybody wanted to talk to us about the widget effect, and we were certainly aware of it coming in, but it was a prominent theme. And this came out in 2009. It was funded by Gates Foundation, Walton, Robertson, and Joyce, so a few other major funders, some more who are more associated with charter school funding, were also supportive here in terms of Walton and Robertson. And the way we've started to characterize this report and some others like it is something more like advocacy research, that when you read the widget effect, you know their policy recommendations right away. They are front-ended in the report, and the research is there. They're putting research into the report, but the sort of details of that are not quite as highlighted in the way that the report is advancing its policy agenda. And so some examples from our interviews that speak to this. So this interviewee is an academic researcher. They mentioned they had such a good way of making the point in that widget effect paper. It was really compelling in the way that academics couldn't be. They gave talking points, not technical appendices. No policymaker is going to read Econometrica. Department of Ed staffer. There were real policy recommendations attached to it, giving a starting point to work from. It was super influential for that reason. It was the most impactful report we read. And then a Democratic Party staffer from Congress. Fast forward a few years to the race to the top. It was very clear that it was going to be the administration's top priority. They were leaving a lot of details to Congress. I think there were elements of that connected in that I would trace back ultimately to the widget effect. And this is just, I mean, I could do more slides of widget effect quotes. It was also, yep. Oh, sorry, then I should back up. So this report was about the state of teacher evaluation at the time. So the New Teacher Project, which is an organization that works on teacher quality. They do programs, but they also do a decent amount of advocacy now. This was their first really prominent report. They're based in Washington, D.C., and what they went out to do is to see how were different districts evaluating their teachers, and what they show is that there's not meaningful variation in teacher effectiveness evaluation. Basically everyone getting okay, you're good enough as a teacher, and that there's no meaningful differentiation. And so they come away recommending that we need to create policies that would ensure meaningful differentiation in teacher evaluation, including many of the policy preferences that are straight from our code book about how you could set up a teacher evaluation system that includes student outcomes. So another area that I want to touch on from the interviews is some reflection on the funder strategy related to research use. So we're seeing sort of the clear earlier articulation of teacher evaluation, teacher effectiveness as a goal. The degree to which funding prior to MET helps to sort of raise the issue in the form of very specific policy recommendations that that was very effective, that actually made it directly into the hands of the Secretary of Education, right, that were brought up by people in congressional hearings. I think I forgot to mention that it was cited 3 times in congressional hearings. That's actually a lot. To get specifically cited by name in congressional hearings is not very frequent, and this is one of the top cited reports in our hearings, and it was mentioned by name by the Education Secretary in public speech as well. So what our interviews also gave the opportunity for is for people to be a little bit reflective, because we were asking them about stuff that had happened, in the last 5 years or so. And one thing that came out in our interviews was some reflection on this research use, for good and or reflective in a more critical way. So this interviewee is a think tank leader and talking about how effective the investments in advocacy research were from this time. So this person points out the issue got a ton of attention, and I think a major contribution to it was the work that Gates had done, not so much to precipitate it all, but in parallel to it all. It's hard to imagine something that would have advanced as much as it did as an issue without Gates's support. We know that it became a major issue. Clearly, in the course of emerging as an issue, it made reference to the kind of information that was being disseminated from the advocacy research projects. So there may be no cause and effect, but there was certainly some echo chamber there. And then this interview, and I should add that this is not the only person who mentioned themes along these lines. This is a former Gates Foundation staffer who was involved at the time in some of these investments, reflecting kind of on the order, the staging, as they call it, of their grant making at this time. And this person said, the staging piece was really interesting. That is, the foundation should have staged research first, student, parent, teacher voice second, new policy practices and operations third. I think the problem was that all 3 were done simultaneously. It would have been better had this been a 10-year investment initiative as opposed to 3 to 5. The foundation could have done a better job had it done more extensive piloting first. And so we were hearing some of this reflecting back on particularly how much some of the advocacy and programmatic things came relatively early on once the foundation had selected teacher effectiveness as their priority. So I'm going to wrap up now with a little bit in terms of conclusions and implications. And one thing is that the funders were effective, I think. We're seeing some evidence of that from the hearings, and we're seeing some evidence of that from the interviews. They were prepared with ideas. Those ideas were supported effectively through well-placed advocates and think tanks, not simply through publications in Econometrica, again, not to diss academic journals, right? But they were placed in ways where they got attention from policymakers, and those ideas were ready when a policy window opened. And there's a certain amount of the idiosyncrasies of the political process that are important to acknowledge here. We also find that research use was somewhat limited. So political and contextual factors could limit research uptake in a national policy debate. And in this specific debate, some of the factors that seem to be playing a role are the strategic role of funders getting highly involved, the availability of a policy window, the fact that the time can be very condensed in terms of when a new idea is taken up, and a high level of think tank activity. The degree to which think tanks that were in most cases being funded by major funders to do these reports, to put them out, to be active in vocalizing these ideas, we're putting quite a bit out into the space. And TNTP is just one example of that. But we also find that there's some retrospective questioning of the priority of advocacy vis-a-vis research. Was this the right way to advance on this particular policy idea? And so I want to conclude with a little bit of an extension here from our findings, and particularly having the opportunity in this audience and being at SEPA, with an audience of people who do a lot of important research on educational policy is to think about some implications for researchers, right? A lot of people in the field are really interested in focusing on communicating with policymakers. How can you have research that may have an impact on policy, help make sure that policy is informed by good empirical research? And a few takeaways that I have from our project are, number one, that we just have to recognize that funders are this key intermediary and influencer, that the funder's use of research matters for how ideas penetrate into policy debates. And so rather than thinking, while we can think about the policymakers, we also have to think about the funders. But it's also the case that researchers seek grants, that there's, in some cases, a power dynamic at play in the fact that funders have money and researchers would like that money to carry out research. And this can create a hard situation, depending on whether what the funder is interested in doing. But what I would argue is that if the goal is making sure that good empirical research reaches the policy debate, then if a funder has an ill-conceived approach or is not well aligned with the empirical research as then influencing the policy debate requires going through the funder in order to see that through. And I'd add by saying that although we're in teacher effectiveness is still in the debate, there's certainly still a lot of work going on in states, for example. I would point to other areas in education policy where we can see the possibility of this dynamic, that there are major private funder roles in personalized learning, in social and emotional learning, in portfolio models, where funders are doing research and doing advocacy simultaneously. And some of the same factors may be very relevant there as well. So thank you, and I really look forward to your questions.